me talking about data behind the scenes with Netflix. So thank you so much for coming. We're going to have a lot of fun. My name is Kim Brown. I'm the founder of Chicago's Women in Big Data. And I just want to do a quick introduction to the group so you understand what we do and how we're able to do all this amazing work with Netflix. So Chicago's Women in Big Data chapter was started about a year ago. We have over 600 members. And we have a mission statement that actually has 3 parts. The first is to bring together women in this space. The second is to help bring more women into the space and really facilitate that learning to make sure that everyone feels that they can approach it, whether they're doing a career transition or coming out of school and interested in it. It's an incredible industry as a vertical and a horizontal, and we really want to grow it and make it more robust. And the third that I'm really passionate about is actually growing the thought leadership of our amazing women leaders in the space. If you look at conference stages, it's still predominantly male. And that's not to say that we don't have amazing people doing incredible work, but you need to have that speaker's profile and you need to do it once to get asked to do it twice. And so the big mission of our group is to get more women on stage, talking about the amazing work that they're doing, to build up that speaker's profile so we have more women thought leaders going out into the world, showing their face and talking about the amazing work that they do. It really does take a village. I know that's a little bit of a cliche, but it takes a whole lot of people, yourselves included, the women that we work with, the organizations and the communities that help really bring incredible innovation and growth together and diversification of the industry. So one of the biggest advocates is 1871, Chicago's Tech Incubator, and actually ranked the world's #1 technology incubator. And so I'm thrilled to introduce an advocate, an incredible professional and leader in the space, in Chicago and globally, Betsy Ziegler. Betsy is the CEO of 1871. She's the Chief Innovation Officer of the Kellogg School of Management from Northwestern University. She's an amazing professional, and I'm thrilled to have you here tonight. Thank you so much.
Good, I'm good, I'm great. It's triumvirate, right? We're going to talk a little bit about tech, a little bit about data, and a little about women, right? It's hard to beat that combination. And so I only have a few minutes before you get to hear from an amazing panel. And what I wanted to do in that couple minutes was ground you all in all the great things happening in Chicago with respect to tech. Spend just a second talking about 1871, and then share my perspective about big data and roles of data analytics and why that's important. Sound like a plan? All right, so in Chicago, everyone here is from Chicago, right? Not everybody. Raise your hand if you're a non-Chicagoan. Okay, all right. So right now, tech makes up about 9% of Chicago's economy, up from 2% just 6 years ago. And if you look at the people that do tech jobs in non-tech companies, that number goes to about 13%. Okay, so a relatively small percentage still, but growing really fast. We are ranked the 6th startup ecosystem in the world. And when you look at the top 20 startup ecosystems, and you study the percentage of female founders in those ecosystems, the average is somewhere around 18 to 19%. And what is the average in Chicago? My team cannot answer. Say it louder. 30%. That's amazing, right? So we've got 30% women, so we have the highest percentage of women, and then it's been quoted a lot over the last couple days because of the Chicago Venture Summit, but it's not new information that Chicago has been ranked #1 for investor returns for at least the second, but I think the 3rd year in a row, where 45% of the investments in Chicago have delivered a 10x or more return. And a lot of the reason for that is a lot of the companies that are being built here are B2B, and we have a large density of Fortune 500 companies in our backyard, around 36. In Chicago, 150 in the Midwest, and so they're making strategic investments. I'm getting a time clock that I worked out 3 minutes left, so I'm going to go much faster. Okay, and then the last one on top IPO exits. If you look at between 2012 and 2017. And you take, we're just going to pretend for just 1 second that Silicon Valley doesn't exist, or we're just going to slide it to the side, just tuck it over there in the corner. And you look at the list, and LA is #1, and Chicago is #2, and New York's #3. And the $30 billion that LA has raised in the last 5 years, 20 of that is Snap. Okay? So we're also, as part of this thought experiment, we're going to pretend like Snap didn't happen either. So we're going to move Silicon to get to Chicago to be number 1. That's Chicago way. So 1871 is the Central Tech address in Chicago. We exist to inspire, equip, and support entrepreneurs to build great businesses. We've got about 470 companies incubating at 1871 right now. A third of those are female founders. Some of those female founders are in the room. A couple of them are over here. And our how, and who's been to 1871? Raise your hand. Okay, a whole bunch of you, right. So those that haven't been, please come by. You can send me an email at Betsy@1871. I'll give you a free pass for the day, so you can come and check it out, or you can join one of the public tours that happen every day except for Friday, right? And so come and check it out. But the how is our special sauce, because it's the inclusive ecosystem that exists there, where we've got 6 venture capital firms and 7 university partners and 500 mentors and 1,000 events and 400 workshops a year, and all of that coming together creates the opportunity for collisions, where an entrepreneur will bounce into somebody else and can help them be successful. And what all that means is that I've got the greatest job in the world, because I get to wake up every day working with my team to increase the probability of success for any single entrepreneur. All right, very quick idea, if not, I've got 1 minute, so as Kim mentioned, I came from Northwestern University. Before that, I was at McKinsey. I built the data analytics function at Northwestern, at the business school, at Kellogg School. And at first, I started off on like basic data governance, basic reporting, and 5 years later, doing extraordinarily advanced analytics, where the mission of that team was to solve the next hardest problem. And they were core to the decision-making of leadership at Kellogg. And that's super important. And so the fact that there's such passion, interest, growing experience in this room for data analytics is amazing. There's no shortage of opportunity. The thing I'll leave you with is that, remember, it's not just about the technical. Because the technical stuff is hard to learn and really important. But a lot about being really good at data analytics is how you drive change, and how you influence people, and how you listen, how you communicate, and how you collaborate and problem solve. And so as you continue to grow in these careers and build that skill set, make sure that you're sort of rounding out both sides of the coin. A lot of people talk about the rise of robots are going to take the job. My view of that is there's always going to be a competitive advantage to be a human. So let's remember that. And that competitive advantage are those more interpersonal related skills that complement the tech. And think about the robot more as being a team member than a competitor. And I think with the panel from Netflix, who has an extraordinary culture, that this is an opportunity for you to learn from them on how they balance both those things. So thank you for a few minutes of your time. Enjoy tonight, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much again, Betsy. Again, take up from everything. If you haven't been checked out, we've got some incredible entrepreneurs here, and really take advantage of the networking as well. You had it beforehand, we'll have it after too. So with that, we'll dive in and get started. I'm actually going to introduce one of our panelists who will be introducing our speakers. So you get to learn more about these women, and we'll be jumping into some really cool things that's going on in their lives. So, Rashmi Shamprasad, why don't you walk on up while I'm giving you a quick introduction? Here you are. So, Rashmi is the Senior Data Engineer at Netflix on the Growth Data Engineering team. She has a Master's in Computer Application and Bachelor's in Commerce. And before joining Netflix, she actually had the kind of interesting job of building ultimate data solutions for PayPal and eBay. So incredible background, incredible individual, and I'm excited to have her on stage. Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, I'm so glad on behalf of Netflix to see all of you guys here. We have a great set of presentations ahead, and I'm here to introduce all of our awesome presenters. I'll first start off with Megha Reddy. She's a Senior Analytics Engineer on the content team at Netflix. She's a graduate of UCLA with degrees in applied mathematics and electrical engineering. She's about 8 years of experience in data analytics, which include being an analytics manager at ZipRecruiter, thank you. ZipRecruiter, and forensic technology consultant at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So thanks a lot, Meghna, for being here today. Followed by Meghna, we have Jen coming over. Jen Raghunavan is she leads our physical studio production science and analytics team at Netflix. Jen has a bachelor's BA in computer science from UC Berkeley. Prior to joining Netflix, Jen led the data engineering team at Loomis Solutions, and she's worked on several projects involving customer and financial analytics, fraud analytics with several consultants. So welcome, Jen. And lastly, we have Monisha Thakur here, who is a senior data engineer on the content data engineering team at Netflix. Prior to joining Netflix, Monisha has been a big data lead at Convertro and a data warehouse lead at MySpace. So I'm really glad to see all of them here, and I would invite Meghna up on the stage. Thank you.
So I'm here today to answer the burning question on everyone's mind: how on earth do we decide what shows and movies to put on service? So just to get you guys into the Netflix mindset, I'm going to share some of my personal favorite shows and movies, all starring strong female leads. Feel free to shout out if you know one of them. Yep, for all the boys that love before. I'm a great rom-com. I've watched more times than it shares that I care to admit. It's a good place. Which is actually a show on NBC, but we licensed the rights for, and it shows that it's an original overseas. We also have Disenchantment, which is a great new cartoon. Got a couple claps from the creator of The Simpsons, and I recognize the drawing. Yeah. And one that I'm super stoked that's coming out in a couple weeks, which is Sabrina the Teenage Witch. So that comes out October 26th, and it's a dark retelling of Sabrina from the creators of Riverdale. So just a few shows and movies to get you guys into the mindset. But the question still remains: how do you choose how to put those shows and movies on the service? So the answer really lays with our creative team. And what the creative team does is they're inspired and supported by, probably guessed it, data. So as part of the content analytics team, my job is to help build tools, not necessarily guidelines or AI-driven decisions, to support our creative teams. So that's really key to what we're doing today. So a question that might be kind of obvious to this room, but is nonetheless a good question to ask: why use data? We're talking about a creative process here. Well, our members trust us to invest wisely in coming up with content that they're going to love. And what data allows us to do is it empowers those human decision makers to figuring out what that optimal mix of content is. Now, we're talking about data in kind of abstract terms, so let's get more specific to content. How do you actually measure content? Said differently, what actually defines the demand signals for a piece of content? So that's kind of a big first order question, and let's think about some of those underlying ingredients. So when we're talking about demand, what potential ingredients are we talking about here? One that might come to mind right away is the number of view hours. How much something gets watched on the service is a pretty good indicator of how popular it is. But you could dig deeper than that as fellow analysts and say, well, not all viewers are necessarily equal. Maybe we want to consider what the composition of that audience is. For example, maybe a certain title is more of an acquisition driver, and among our audiences, it's getting more people to sign up to watch that piece of content. Another thing you might want to consider is ratings. You know, what are the critical and audience reviews for that piece of content online? And of course, everybody loves good hardware, so if it's winning Oscars or Emmys, there's something to be said for that as well. So we've got all these different components. Which one would you want to choose to encapsulate value? Well, like a good SAT question, the answer is all of them. It's quite a good one, right? So now that we have our sort of list of ingredients, the next question that a good analyst might ask is, well, how do you combine all of these disparate data signals and demand signals into a single, easily digestible value metric? So let's apply some algebraic terms, which is the space we're all comfortable in. So let's call this A. We'll say that for Glow, which is an awesome dramedy about AIDS wrestlers, you can see that it's got pretty good ratings. Both critical and audience scores are really high for Glow. So let's keep that as variable A. Another thing you might consider is Emmys. So this past year, we did awesome at the Emmys. You can see over the years, the number of nominations and wins for Netflix as a whole has gone up, and Glow was among them. We actually won a couple of Emmys from Glow as well. So maybe that's something you want to consider as part of the evaluation. So we're going to call that B. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, how much is this getting viewed? How many devices is it getting viewed on? What does that member base look like? So let's call that C. So we've got A, B, C. How do you want to combine that into a demand metric? Well, oftentimes you don't actually need to overcomplicate it, and you can just think of it as a composite metric. So here, if you think of the weights X, Y, and Z that you would apply to demand signals A, B, and C, you can combine them in a linear way and call that your value metric. Of course, this is all kind of abstracted away, and we're not talking about the details, but the underlying concept is really fundamental to what we're doing. So now we've been talking about sort of the historical value. Once it's on the service, you have all of this information. But now let's switch over to the predictive space and think, well, how can we use machine learning to help predict some of these values? So let's start with licensed content. Fundamentally in content, there's two different spaces. There's licensed or originals. When we're talking about licensing, we're talking about shows and movies that have already existed out in the ecosystem. Movies that have been in theaters, shows that have been on networks. And now that they've been out of the theaters, we have the option of licensing rights for a certain amount of time. So here are just a few examples of movies and TV shows that we might want to put on the service. So that's sort of step one, is going to a studio or a vendor and saying, what available shows are there that we could license? The second thing we want to do is break down what the demand features are for those titles. So you might recognize some of these objects because they're actually a lot of the same inputs that we were talking about in the valuation space. So here's, just like we were talking about before, you might want to look at things like box office sales, or maybe the star power associated with the big blockbuster movie, or the number of Emmys or Oscars that it won. So all of those same signals can now be thought of in the ML space as demand features. Next, the sort of data science magic takes over, and you input all of these demand features into a suite of models. Now here's a simplified example where you have an ensemble of 3 different decision trees. And what you might do is have a suite of models that have different outputs, and then you look at which ones have the lowest error scores, the highest predictive value, and then that'll give you a single value prediction. Of course, we're using more than 3 decision trees, and our awesome demand modeling team is really considering every ML technique under the sun to figure out what the best predictions are. Now you might say, okay, great, I've got my prediction in my hand, I know how much this is worth, we're done. But we're really not, because that's where we hand it over to the content buying team, and they then employ all of the deep industry expertise that they have to figure out what is this really worth in the context of the larger industry space. So, for example, one of the buyer judgments that they might need to make is, well, I'm not buying this one title in a vacuum. It really has more to do with our relationship with the studio and the fact that we might be buying 100 titles from them. So how do we find the optimal mix in there? There's also really intricate deal terms that can take place. Like, one thing I didn't realize going in was that if you're doing like a TV show licensing, you could do something called a run of series, where you're agreeing to license a show that's still on the air, and you don't actually know how many seasons it's going to go. So you're kind of taking the bet of, do I think this is going to be a 4-season show or a 10-season show? So there's quite a lot of judgment in there that the data can't really tell you. So at the end of all of this, if the buyer feels like this is going to be a value proposition that's positive to the service, they'll go ahead and make that deal. Now let's think about the original space, because now with original content, you have a much harder problem because you have a lot less information than on the license side. We're not talking about something that hasn't actually been made yet. So how do you apply ML in that situation? It's a more difficult problem for a couple of key reasons. Like you might guess, you have less data. If it's a movie that's being pitched to us, it hasn't actually been in theaters, so you don't have box office results or ratings or reviews. Along those same lines, it's also kind of a moving target. Remember, we're in a creative space, so we're talking about something that might have been pitched as a movie, but maybe it's better served as a miniseries. And there's a lot of kind of moving pieces that Jen's going to be kind of diving into afterwards, after this talk on the studio production side. And overall, it's just much more fungible. You know, the casting director may not have picked the talent associated with it, which is going to help dictate the budget and all of these other decisions, which are huge when it comes to what the end product is going to look like. So going back to our data science side, how do you then make a predictive model when you don't have any of the demand features that we talked about before? Well, we can go through a real life example. So call it about 6 years ago, our creative execs got handed the script for House of Cards. And all it was the script for a pilot, maybe it wasn't cast yet. And what the creatives need to do is figure out, well, where does that kind of sit in the ecosystem of all the other titles that have ever existed? And what the team might say is, well, it's sort of West Wing meets Breaking Bad. It's kind of somewhere in between those two things. Once they've decided that, then what they can do is say, well, what are some of the other comparative titles or comps that are most similar and kind of live in that same universe? So shows like Blacklist or Mad Men sort of feel like they're in the same area and are things that people would similarly enjoy. Now that we've gotten down to these titles, we're back in the license world because these are all shows that have been out and we do know a lot of information about them. So you can use these comparative titles and then apply the ML of saying, well, what was the predictive value of these shows, and say that House of Cards is probably going to fit somewhere in that space. So you probably got the sense of this already, but what we're doing is really both art and science. You know, predictions can only get us so far, and a big part of what we're doing is handing off our best predictions to the content creative team so that they can then apply their judgment and industry expertise to coming up with great content. Along those same lines, I love this quote from Cindy Holland, who's one of our creative execs, and she was involved in Orange is the New Black, which was one of our very first hits. And what I love about this quote is she says the magic really comes from the spirit and enthusiasm of the creators themselves. And that's something that data can't quantify. I mean, take a show like Orange, which is takes place in a women's prison. It features a diverse female cast. There's nothing in the historical data that would have told us that this was going to be a hit. So that's really where the art meets science. So I know what you're all thinking, well, what does that actually mean for me? What does it mean to sit down at a computer and be a data analyst in this space? Well, some of the day-to-day technical objectives that I'm always thinking about is how do we iterate and improve on these value metrics? How do we incorporate new sources of data and compute and surface those metrics in a way that's digestible by non-technical audiences? And I think that last part is really huge because we can play with numbers all day long, but in order for it to impact business decisions, we need to figure out a way to tell that story to a non-technical audience. And how do you do that? Well, hopefully you recognize some of the terms up here. There's a lot of SQL. Here are just a few of the flavors that we use at Netflix. But ultimately, you're using SQL and you're using data ETL as the backbone to make sure that your reports are running every day. And Manisha's going to be talking about how we manage that infrastructure at Netflix. And then ultimately to expose it, I have Tableau on here, but really, Looker, any kind of the BI Viz tool is pretty key in exposing the data and getting it out in a way that's easily readable by non-tech audiences. So I'll leave you with one final thought, which is that what we're doing is a lot of hard science, but what's really unique about the content analytics space is that it's where this science meets art. And it's really that handoff and working with really creative folks that makes the job really unique and really gratifying. So, thank you.
All right, thanks, Meghana. So Meghana talked a little bit about how we decide what content to put on the Netflix service. I'm going to dig into how we use data to support the creation of that content in the first place. I'll kick us off with a brief history of the studio at Netflix and talk about what is production. What does this actually mean when we say studio and physical production? Similar to Meghana, I'll also motivate our discussion a bit by talking about why we're thinking about data in really the creative heart of the business and some of the challenges that we're thinking through along the way. So here's our Netflix studio in LA, that big building right there. And as a bit of trivia for you, this is actually the original Warner Brothers lot. It's where the first talking film was made back in 1927, called The Jazz Singer. But if we fast forward to 2012, in February of 2012, we launched Lilyhammer. on Netflix. This is a dark comedy about a mobster who tries to restart his life in Norway. But it's great. I haven't seen it, but if you have, I'd love to hear about it. But it's really exciting because this was the first time that Netflix offered exclusive content. You couldn't see it anywhere else except for Netflix. In 2013, we launched House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. And this is exciting because it was back at a time when launching the entire season of a show on a streaming service in one day made headline news. Now things have changed quite a bit, and if we move forward to 2016, this was the year that we began making self-managed originals. So Megan had touched on this a little bit, but a self-managed original is content that we're not licensing from anywhere. No one has made this. No one has planned it, filmed it, edited it. All of that is now Netflix's responsibility. And Stranger Things, which you may have heard of, is one of the first titles that we self-managed. And this was followed by The OA, Mindhunter, Glow, and if we look at 2018, here are some of the titles that we've launched in the first half of 2018 alone. So this is a really exciting and expanding space for us. But what is production? What does this actually involve? It's not all red carpets, it's not all magazine interviews, it's actually a lot of work. And I like using the example of someone with a vision for building a new home, right? They have a vision for what they want this space to be. They'll reach out to an architect, and that architect will design blueprints. From there, they'll reach out to a general contractor. And again, from there, that general contractor reaches out to their network of experts. Electricians, stonemasons, landscapers, interior designers, a massive network of people, all experts in their domain, who come together to bring this vision to life. Production is actually not that different. It's a similar supply chain when we look behind the scenes. A writer or creator will start with a vision, and that's usually represented by a script. And this is in many ways similar to the blueprint for architecture. They connect with producers, who then reach out to their network of experts. Stunt coordinators, hair and makeup, set designers, drivers, post-production editors, the list goes on and on. It's a huge network of people. But they all come together and bring their creative expertise in to bring this vision to life. But again, we ask, why data? We have all of these creative experts coming together, and we're telling stories, we're not sharing algorithms. What's the point of using data in such a creative space? Well, I'll start with why not. Similar to buying content, data doesn't replace creative freedom. These are all incredibly strong female leads that don't need data to tell them what to say or how to act. All of that comes together because of the strength of the creative team behind them. But if we think back to the supply chain analogy, there are so many moving pieces that we can think about with data so that we're removing operational burdens and empowering our crew to do what they do best. We use data to build the tools that give our creators the freedom to tell their stories across geographic boundaries. But how? There's a number of challenges that we're thinking about, and I'll talk about two of them. The first one is building visibility, which I'm sure we've all dealt with our share of disparate data sources, things that don't want to connect. It's not a problem that's unique to any space. But what I didn't even realize about production when I started at Netflix is that most of the industry is still using paper. Just to make one film, there are hundreds of paper documents, many of which are maintained by different members of the production team. They're stored separately. It's a massive number of disparate sources of data, and it's all on paper. So the challenge for us is not only how do we collect this information, but how do we draw connections across all of the unique productions that these documents reflect? Visualization is a huge part of tackling this problem. So here, we can pull data together and make it easily digestible by our creative teams. What we might look at here is something like equipment. There are certain types of cameras or workstations that are incredibly expensive because they're designed for certain types of production. And on top of that equipment being really expensive, shipping that equipment around the world is even more expensive. So if we start to look at what are the productions that are actually using this equipment, where is that happening, and where is it really complicated, maybe there's an inefficiency there. And maybe that efficiency helps us give our creators more of their budget back, in a sense, so they can put that money on screen. A second challenge is enabling human expertise. Now, before I talk about Netflix here, I'll actually go through a brief example from the NFL, of all places. So in the past, when they were devising a schedule for the games of a season, this was done completely manually. The league executives would get in a room and they would think about across the 17 teams and 32 weeks of a season and all the constraints they need to think about. They would arrange pegs on what, like imagine a valet parking station with keys, just to come up with one option for a schedule. They would move these pegs around and try to come up with something. So it was a massive amount of manual work just to come up with one option. But a few years ago, the NFL started experimenting with optimization models. And what optimization models do is they take a mathematical equation and try to minimize or maximize that equation subject to a number of constraints. This lines up really well for schedule problems because many of the things we talk about here translate really well to math. We have a number of variables, we have a number of constraints, and our objective is to minimize or maximize something, usually cost or time. And so after the NFL started exploring this tool, they now generate trillions of options for schedules that their league executives still review and make a judgment call on. But this speeds up the process tremendously. So can we do this for film? Well, the way that this works in practice is a director will sit down with a script and they will break it down, as it's called, for things like scenes, interior versus exterior, location, time, actors, and many more. And just like the NFL in the past, this was done on a corkboard where they would put literal strips of paper corresponding to the scenes in a script and move them around to try to come up with an option. Now, there is software that has digitized some of this process, but it hasn't done much by way of helping it be more efficient. Now, I do want to point out that it's not entirely bad that this is a manual process. It helps a director absorb the material, think about their vision for the story. But if someone gets hurt, or there's a lightning storm, or a stage isn't available, or there's inevitably some kind of delay in production, a lot of that schedule goes out the window and they have to start from scratch. So if we can think about using data to help inform their process, maybe we can help them be more of the creative expert that they are and not worry so much about the logistics. I want to close this out with a quote from Shonda Rhimes, who has created some of the most addictive television shows that I think I've ever seen in my entire life. She is now partnering with us on some really exciting new content. But she said that the brand of Netflix is just creativity. And she loves it because it gives her the ability to just write what she wants to write, when she wants to write it. And it's so exciting for us to think that in its own way, data gets to be part of enabling these visionaries to do what they do best. Thank you.
I'm here to take you behind the scenes into content data engineering and infrastructure at Netflix. Let me talk to you a little bit about how the org is structured. There is content and studio data engineering that I'm a part of. There's product, marketing, and streaming. There's membership, fintech, growth, There's experimentation and data infrastructure. The data infrastructure team empowers and enables all the different data engineers in all of these different sub-teams. As a company, Netflix has lots of different data needs. And the Data Engineering and Infrastructure org, also referred to as DEI, serves the different needs of organizations. So we would serve analysts to create ad hoc reports, dashboards, email launch reports. We would support scientists for the predictive modeling, for content validation, like Meghna talked about, for figuring out, for giving them data for PBR, or personalized video recommendation systems. For engineering teams to help figure out how they need to scale their infrastructure for new title launches. So there's myriad different ways that the DEI team serves the organization. Getting into the ecosystem a little bit, our central data warehouse is in S3, and it can be queried using Presto, Spark, Pig, Hive. There's also data that we have in Redshift and Snowflake. All of this data can be accessed via Tableau reports. Users can come and query the data sets in their individual domains. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the data infrastructure teams provides tools and services to make this data really easily accessible. Let me get a little bit more detailed into content data. What is the kind of content data that exists in the data warehouse? What is the title? What is the relationship between the viewable to a season to a show? What is the runtime for viewable? What is the description of the title? What languages is it available in? What are the different countries a title is available in? What are the rights associated with it? Do we have global rights for a title? Or do we have rights for a title country by country? What is the cost associated with the title? What is the budget in different territories? What is the original language of a title? What are the different languages it's available in? Is it subtitled, dubbed in different languages? What is the cast and talent associated with the title? Viewing. How much is a particular title viewed? Or is the viewing different by different territories? Does a title get viewed more in one region versus the other? Are there documentaries that do better in one region than the other? Genre-specific analysis? Those kinds of questions can be also served by the data that comes from the content team. So think of content team that provides content metadata that includes title metadata, budget information, content viewing metrics to the entire Netflix org. In the evolution of Netflix, it started off as a DVD company, then became a streaming company in North America, in Latin America, in Europe, and now globally, serving 130 million members worldwide, every day perhaps. This resulted directly in complexity increase in the business. As Jen talked about, in the production space, we're leaning in really heavily into our producing our own original content. And so we are entering into new parts of the business, pre-production, production, post, and launch. This has increased the complexity of the business enormously and directly affects the day-to-day of a content data engineer. What are the types of complexities that we see? There's integration complexity. There are all these different systems that we pull data from, and we need to query different databases, ingest data from different APIs in order to bring it into the warehouse. There is technical complexity. The business transformation logic that gets applied to take all this data coming in from different systems and provide it to the users in a clear, consistent format has gotten increasingly complex. There's business complexity. The business has gotten increasingly complex as we've grown in scale and scope. Let me talk through an example. What are the number of episodes in a season? It's kind of a straightforward question, like it should be kind of simple. The answer is, it depends. It's not a satisfactory answer, but let's dig into why that may be. At the beginning, when a title is being pursued, we're trying to figure out if this is something that we want to produce. There may be a forecasted number of episodes. It's really early in the pipeline. Someone's talking about it and estimating that we'll end up with a certain number of episodes. further along in the pipeline as it gets to the production stage and there's more creative input that grows with the creation of the title, the number of episodes can change. You can perhaps add one, you can perhaps remove one. After production, there's post, and then finally it launches on the service and comes to your tablets and phones and TVs at home, and it could be packaged differently by the product. You could take one big season and cut it into 2 different parts. And so the total number of episodes that is in a season totally depends on the lens with which you're asking the question. So we talk about complexity and the complexity of the business and how it plays into the role of a data engineer. Therefore, one of the basic tenets of a data engineer becomes taking this complexity, abstracting all the business logic that's in it, and turning it into clarity, so that the users who are querying the data have a clear sense of what it is that they're using and have a clear sense of how they need to use it. Therefore, the number of episodes in a season would be totally depending on what are you looking for. Are you looking for the forecasted number of episodes, the produced number of episodes, or the episodes that were launched on the service? All of this means that there is tremendous context that goes in the business. And a role of the data engineer involves taking in all that business context, combining and abstracting it away as much as possible away from the user, but making it really clear to the user who's using the data of what that particular data point is. So that when they bring it in a report, when they use it in Asymmetric, they know what is behind it, and they can have the most knowledge to use it in a smart way. Let's talk about how this context is shared and exposed in the data warehouse. The goal of the data warehouse is going to be self-service. As the organization has grown and increased in size, we want the users who come to the data warehouse to be able to look at a metric and then be able to clearly understand what it is. Think of it as clear labeling, clear discoverability, understanding what it is, and being able to use it, expecting quality data in a consistent fashion. Let's go back to this slide that I started off my presentation with. So the data infrastructure team is kind of the foundational structure of the DEI org. It provides tools and services that allows sharing context possible. And I can talk a little bit more about what are some of the tools and services that are offered by this team. One of them is the Big Data Portal. A Big Data Portal is a tool within Netflix that allows users to query databases that are across different systems. So you could have data in S3 that can be queried by a Hive, you could have that can be queried by a Presto, data in Redshift, in Snowflake, and these data points can then be shared, downloaded as Tableau workbooks, and so it really increases the ease of usage and discoverability. It also has information that tells you who's the owner of a table, when was the last time this data was loaded, who created it, who are the downstream users of it. So it gives you a lineage of the different data points of the user, and it really kind of makes the data process transparent. You have a clear understanding of who loads this data, when was it created, and is it safe to use. There's also documentation. You can go and look at different data tables that are brought in by different teams and understand what are the nuances around this data. Metacat is another internal tool at Netflix, and what it does is it allows a unified API across different systems. So you could have data in Redshift or Snowflake or Hive, and users can look at the tables across different systems in a unified way. They can look at the metadata, they can add additional business metadata to it. And this really helps when you're looking at a table in a different system and you've added metadata to another system, and you can really look at it in one central place. It's useful for transporting data as well. In summary, the life of a data engineer at Netflix includes sourcing data from different APIs, from different databases, applying ETL, applying transformation logic to it, and in the end, ending up with reports and dashboards and tools that enable business decision making. It really comes down to technology. It comes down to innovation, culture, and stunning colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much again. We're actually going to give one more round of applause. And we're going to invite our speakers up on stage and do about 30 minutes of question and answer with the panel. So Rashmi, come on up. Thank you so much. Meghana, Jen, and hi, Manisha. It's like, you're good on your mic? Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much again. That was amazing and really interesting. So we had a lot of fun. And by the way, if you're online, if you're on Twitter, hashtag #SheRules with Netflix Data, right? At Netflix Data is what you can follow and participate in the conversation. And we're so excited that we are the first stop on Netflix national tour for the #SheRules event. So check it out. Feel free to take pictures, post, enjoy the conversation. So we're going to get started. I know we had a lot of information, so we're just going to go down the line again and do a quick lightning introduction. So really quickly, your name, your position, the team you work on, and how long have you been at Netflix for? Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I'm Rashmi. I'm a senior data engineer on the growth data engineering at Netflix. I've been with Netflix for about 2.5 years now. And I work on projects related to non-member acquisition and non-member experimentation. And what that means is really trying to get people to sign up for Netflix. Yep,
Great, thank you.
Hi again. My name is Meghana Reddy, and I've also been at Netflix for about 2.5 years. And I'm a senior analytics engineer on the content performance science and analytics team. And what that means is what we talked about before, so a lot of the content evaluation stuff.
I'm Manisha, and I'm a content data engineer on the content DI team. I've been at Netflix around 6 years now, and the team that I'm on works on building content metadata and content metrics to program content to delight millions of members worldwide.
I'm Jen. I'm a manager in our science and analytics org, leading our studio and production team to think about how we can empower all of our creative teams around the world making great content.
Awesome.
And I've been there for about 1.5 years.
Great, thank you. So we'll go back, Jen, down the line. I think an awesome question that I'm excited to actually hear what you all think. So your favorite Netflix original and your favorite female lead?
Oh, easy. So easy. My favorite is Glow by far, and I think the second season's better than the first, so if you've started it, stick it out. And my favorite female lead is from Altered Carbon. One of the women in that show is Renee Goldsberry. She's from Hamilton, but she plays a character named Kel-Chris Falconer, who I think is pretty awesome.
I'm a huge foodie. I love Chef's Table. One of my favorite leads from that show is Christina Tosi. She's an amazing dessert magic maker, and she's opened her new restaurant or new bakery Milk in LA, so I'm very excited about her.
Yeah, it's like 4-hour runs there,
Yes.
so that hype to die down. So my favorite show, so I'm gonna really lower the IQ bar here. My favorite show is American Vandal, which is a hilarious mockumentary that takes place in a high school. It's about vandalism in a high school. It's super funny, you should check it out. And I'd say my favorite lead is actually from Disenchantment. The main character in that is Princess Bean, and she's voiced by Abby Jacobson from Broad City. It's a great show.
My favorite Netflix show is BoJack Horseman, and that's because that's what I last watched. And my favorite female lead is, I forget the name, but she plays Trish Walker on Jessica Jones. So I really like it.
Great, thank you so much. I love Disenchantment, by the way. I really like it. Yeah, that's currently my favorite. It's so funny. If you haven't seen it, it's awesome. So, if you're interested in Netflix, I think one really cool way to get exposed to the company is to go to their jobs page and look at their culture subpage. And they've just got this incredible amount of information, all in normal people speak, not a whole lot of jargon, on the Netflix culture. And so I'm going to actually read the pillars that they walk through. Judgment, communication, curiosity, courage, passion, selflessness, innovation, inclusion, impact, and integrity. And working with this incredible team over the last couple months to put this together, it was awesome to actually see that play out. I mean, it's truly something that they embody naturally, and it was incredible to see how innate it was in every conversation that they had with each other and that we had together. And so when you walk into a situation, how does the Netflix culture affect and influence your specific roles? Because it is so strong in how they flow through the company. And we'll kind of go down the line because I think that culture question is pretty big.
So in the acquisition space, we're constantly trying out new things just to see what's going to work. And so we have to be really open-minded and encourage curiosity to try out new ideas. And then essentially communicate that idea across the various stakeholder groups so that we can take it from just ideation to reality. So all of those have parallels in my role because I'm essentially building data solutions that would power those ideas. So I see a lot of that happening. A lot of discussion and debates around like the solutions that we come up with, what the outcomes might be, and and you'll hear this phrase really often, like you have stunning colleagues to bounce your ideas off of them, so it works out great.
Awesome, thank you.
So for me, out of that list, I would probably pick selflessness. So being on the analytics side, I'm more on the front end, and I'm working with business stakeholders, with our awesome data engineering org, and oftentimes working with a lot of other data teams as well. So one of the things, I was actually pretty skeptical of it when I first started. Like, there's no way that people are as great as you make them sound. But I've been there 2.5 years, and I'm constantly surprised by how responsive everybody is. So I could be emailing somebody in Singapore or in our Bay Area office who I've never met before. But as long as I give the context of like, hey, this is somewhat urgent, everyone is so super helpful and willing to give up as much of their time as you need. And I definitely wouldn't be successful in my role if it wasn't for the selflessness of others. So that's huge for me.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll pick two. Communication, I think that is definitely the underpinning of day-to-day. When you're interacting with data scientists and analysts and you're figuring out what is the challenge and what is the problem that they're really trying to solve and figuring out how you can really help them, I think really trying to listen in and communicate what you can and cannot provide, I think is super helpful. And the other thing is impact. I feel like on a day-to-day basis, there's lots of different things going on. You're trying to figure out where can I invest my time most wisely. And the thing that's really useful is like, what am I doing that is going to be most impactful to the business? What is it going to drive the business forward? Is it going to be Netflix's best interest? So I think those two, day to day, I feel like I definitely lean heavily on.
Yeah.
I think for me it's courage. Especially for my team, we're experimenting with data in a very, very new space, in a way that the rest of the entertainment industry hasn't really thought about. So everything that we do is very new. Even putting together a simple heat map visual is, it could go into a tool that none of our production coordinators have ever used before. And it's sort of on us to be the voice of how data can support people. And I think it takes a lot of courage from my whole team to speak up when they see an opportunity to use data or a way we could better partner or something they're really excited about, just spending some of their time on it to see if there's something there. And I'm constantly inspired by the work that everyone is doing.
Awesome. Well, I'm actually going to keep it with you, Jen, because I think that touches on kind of that bigger question. You're in a space that's constantly evolving. There are really no answers or roadmaps that you're working off of. You've got really significant business that you've got to drive. I mean, there's absolutely hard metrics. And Netflix, being a data-driven company is absolutely tracking those business goals, but you've got this foundation of values. And so how do you walk into an ambiguous business problem or challenge and kind of balance the business side and the values with the sense that you're going in and you don't have a roadmap to follow? How do you address that?
Yeah, I think for me it's a couple things. One of them is that as a leader, I really look to my team to also be leaders in the work that they do. Megan had mentioned stunning colleagues, and that applies to everybody. I look to my team to get their thoughts on what they think we should work on. Or, hey, does this project make sense? Is this really where the impact is? What do you think? And I try to keep, and as all of us do, we try to keep that discussion really open and really innovative. So I think we bounce a lot of ideas off of each other, and that's really helpful. The other is that we have really great partnerships with our stakeholders. I've been in places where it feels like the data team is sort of, you're just taking tickets. And I feel like at Netflix, we are really partners to our stakeholders. We're partners in doing the work, we're partners in thinking about the work, and they bring all of this industry context. We bring all of the data expertise, and we meet in the middle in a really, really effective way. And that helps me feel more confident in the decisions we make as a team.
That's great. I know, Rashmi, we had a conversation before we were coming here today. Was there anything that you want to add from your perspective, which is a slightly different approach than Jen?
Yeah, so I think all of the key points that Jen touched on was, relying on your team and gathering context from people. It's sort of, you have to ask questions to figure out what is it that people are trying to get out of the whole exercise. And depending on whom you talk to, you're going to get very different perspectives. They're looking at very different slices of the pie.
Yeah.
And it helps to just talk to people. And something comes to mind. One of my colleagues mentioned that once you join Netflix, everybody's just a shoulder tap away. So just going and talking to people and just getting that context and then figuring out what you need to build for them, I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I wanted to make sense too with that communication piece. If it's built into the culture, you've got people that are going to be open to you going over and saying, hey, can you impact this a little bit more?
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. So our next question, and we're going to get a little bit more into the data tech side because that's the fun part while we're all here. So talk about your technology stack and pipeline. How are you using it? Does it meet your expectations? What are the limitations? I mean, really, we talked about a lot here in your presentations, but what are some of the specifics that you're using? And then the back half of that question is, did you know that technology joining Netflix, or did you have transferable skills that you were able to bring and then learn on the job what you needed to know? Now, there's a lot of folks in the audience that are always asking this question at the events we have, so I'm really curious. Alicia, you want to start?
So on a day-to-day, I spend a lot of time in Python and PySpark and SQL, pulling the data, looking at the data. And so there's a lot of that. There's other members in different teams who will spend a lot more time depending on their use case in Java or Scala. So there's like a lot of just ETL and programming and scripting going on. Prior to joining Netflix, I'd worked in like big data before, so I did have like distributed computing knowledge and worked in AWS and NPP databases like Astrodata. I do think that Netflix fosters internally a really culture of curiosity and learning. So a lot of the skills, like Spark skills, are definitely things that I picked up once I was at Netflix. There's internal training sessions that happen. There are experts who contribute to the Spark code base who are at Netflix that you can go and ask questions. There are internal user groups and Slack channels where I can ask a noob question and someone's going to help me out. So there's definitely an environment of learning and growth and constant improvement, which I think is, makes it better.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think I could probably build on that from the kind of AE perspective.
Yeah.
So I'd say a lot of the day-to-day tools are the same. I'm also spending a lot of time in SQL, but kind of through a different lens. So I'm not going to be as much of an expert in how to, optimize, certain big tables. Like I don't always know what to partition by, and that's where I'll tap Manisha on the shoulder and she'll help me out. But from an AE perspective, so I'm still using a lot of different SQL languages, and then of course the side of like, well, how do you then expose it? And for our business stakeholders, it could be anything from like an Excel or CSV output to a Tableau dashboard or a push report so that they're getting email updates on their launch titles. In terms of what I knew, I've kind of in the same boat where I knew some of the fundamental skills, but not the language, not those flavors themselves. So with SQL, I had done a lot in Oracle, SQL Server, and Redshift, so I had kind of like some exposure to distributed systems, but certainly nothing on the scale of what Netflix does with something like the big data portal, which Manisha showed, where you can, just from a drop-down pick any SQL engine you want. So that was something that I definitely had to learn, was to increase my kind of dexterity and also just be curious and be open to the fact that, like, hey, I've learned all of these SQL languages up till now, there's no reason I can't learn these next 3. And I think that environment is huge, and it's something for all of you to keep in mind too, is you don't need to necessarily have those skills themselves as long as you have the building blocks and the foundation where you know that you can pick them up, which I think is really huge too.
Well, and it sounds like, you have these teams where everyone's kind of bringing to the table a different piece of the puzzle, a different aspect, so no one's really coming in knowing exactly what the company's using. It was probably formed by just having a lot of people knowing a little bit and thinking about it together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, so I'm curious, as I get ready for the next question, were you nervous when you were interviewing? Where you're like, I actually am going to have to say I don't know, but I know enough to know that I can learn it?
I was nervous for the first 4 months of working.
Yeah?
I realized that I don't actually know. Yeah, no, I don't get that imposter syndrome, definitely.
It's so funny. Did you guys have that too, or did you walk in like, of course I'm not supposed to know that, so I know enough to learn it?
Yeah, I think you come in knowing that you know how to work with the tools and know that you can ask questions.
Yeah.
And I think those two will kind of set the stage for you to be successful, because you'll pick it up along the way if you ask the right questions and talk to the right people and really immerse yourself in the problem.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like for folks in the audience that are looking to get into the space or looking for that next role, is to be comfortable saying, I don't need to walk in and sit in an interview and say, yes, of course I know everything about everything, and to be really honest and genuine.
I actually have a story on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was looking at a Spark job once, and there's this sort of visual outline of how the job's going to complete. I was like, I literally have no idea what I'm looking at. This looks like I just made a bunch of drawings of circles. I have no idea. And so I pinged one of our data engineers about it, and he was like, oh my god, I know, right? It's the worst. I was like, this is a real thing. I can ask these questions, I don't have to know everything. And I think over the first few months, it was it's okay. But I can frame this in the tools that I do know and just pick up the skills as I go.
Yeah.
So I think there's a kind of foundation, right? But from there you build. This is a very iterative space.
Well, and to your point about that courage piece, being in a culture that allows it, but also having the courage to say, am I crazy, or does this actually look as gibberish as it looks? And then have someone go, oh yeah, no, this is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good story.
Yeah.
So how, you each are in different groups. Netflix is an incredibly complex company. That means there's probably a ton of Venn diagrams of organizations where people come together, and you're going to have a lot of those dotted line collaborations. So from an organization standpoint, how do you all work together? So what are the different interactions? What's the communication styles? You've got a lot of different stakeholders, so how do you communicate with each other, different data stakeholders, and then how does that map into the communication with the different pieces of the organization? So it's a little bit of, it's kind of an org question, and how do you not be siloed, because I think there's a lot of data sharing and insight sharing that's going on.
I guess I can
Sure.
answer that. So when I think about it, I feel like Netflix is a very conversation-driven culture, and when I say conversation-driven, it's either physically having a face-to-face conversation or using technology to your advantage, tools like Slack. We are a very memo-heavy culture. We write a lot of memos, and that gives everybody the opportunity to share ideas very openly.
Interesting.
Yeah,
it's like if we were going to Google a memo template like that, you get an email and it says memo.
Yeah, I mean it's about an idea. What was the analysis done around it? You know, what is the thought process? What are the takeaways? Yeah, white paper. Like
That's
it's
really cool.
And you know, it's great because you cannot physically be present in all of those meetings. You know, trying to get a rundown of everything that's going on, and this becomes a good channel to sort of get a gist of all of the data. And you know, you don't have to be physically present. You can just comment on memos when you get time. So yeah, that's one way in which we can we share information. As far as the tech side goes, you know, we have a lot of tech talks almost on a weekly basis, I would want to say, where we come and talk about, you know, problem areas that we've dealt with and how we've solved those problems. And that sort of gives, you know, way so that you're not sort of reinventing the wheel and, you know, sort of learning from, you know, each other's practices and building up further on that and accelerating a whole lot faster.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's...
Thank you. Do you want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of building on what Rajma said and my point earlier about selflessness, it's kind of crazy that it works as organically as it does, considering the size of the company, but a lot of it is just based on conversations and emails, but there's that sort of trust underneath it all, that we know that if I send out a note or a Slack ping, that I'm going to hear back and it doesn't just go like into the void. So I really appreciate that that's the culture and that it works, because the alternative is having a lot of, you know, sort of checks and balances and structure in place, which, you know, if done incorrectly, kind of just slows things down. So I like that that's not really the case, and that I can just trust that whoever it is, you know, whether it's like a senior VP or a fellow analyst, that they're going to respond and be kind of respectful of your time.
That's awesome. Who's been at the company for 6 years? Has it been, as it's kind of grown and expanded, so now you've got multiple offices on the West Coast, you're in Amsterdam, you're in Latin America, have you felt any bumps with that, or is I you know, obviously worked with the team, the recruiters are amazing and the sourcing's amazing, so has it been kind of seamless for when people join the team and you expand, it just kind of clicks and people get it?
I think as we've grown, we've definitely seen ourselves and catch ourselves in places where we're either siloed or have tribal knowledge that is in a particular team or a particular individual. So I think we've definitely become a little bit more deliberate about it.
Okay.
And therefore are leaning more towards self-service. So as there are different data organizations and different teams in Singapore, Amsterdam, we want an analyst in the Singapore office to feel as empowered as an analyst in the LA office or in the LG office. And the way to do it is to kind of making the context that we know internally exposed to them, so that they're able to do exactly what their needs are without necessarily feeling that they need to be in the same time zone or in the same office as we.
Yeah, that word empowered, that absolutely makes sense, where they don't have to ask permission or feel like they're being gate kept out of a certain data set.
It's definitely a learning experience, though. Like one of our big content meetings, it wasn't until this past year that somebody spoke up and said, "Hey, you realize this is like 3 a.m. in Japan?" And we're like, "Oh yeah, that's not respectful of the time." So then we kind of scheduled it so there's like an evening one for the Asian.
Did they join the call?
Oh yeah, they were still doing that. And then later, like we had associates who went there for like a rotation and would come back, and they're like, "Yeah, you're basically operating on LA time, but in another office." So we've kind of figured out ways to, you know, allow them to kind of sleep at normal hours. And what we did was schedule our big content meetings so that they're either in the evenings for the Asia team to join or early in the morning for our European offices to join. So those are the kind of things that we kind of figure out as we go.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then you hear it, you make an adjustment. You don't say, "Well, this is what it is," and they'll figure it out. Or don't join the call. Yeah, and that's remarkable that they joined. Like that is super commitment, and then didn't say anything. I don't know. I would probably slide that in the first time. Like, oh, I don't know, I'm just sitting here at 3 a.m.
Pretty much. Yeah, eventually they did, and that's great. Like that shows courage on their part.
Yes, yeah, and trust that someone's going to hear them and make an adjustment. That's an awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So our last question, and then I want to have a minute to open up for the audience questions. But let's talk about data and inclusion in technology. You know, I'm kind of curious if you have any stories that you want to share. I'm not going to say, do you think it adds to competitive advantage? I think we all understand that when you have diverse and inclusive teams, it does provide a competitive advantage. The question is, you know, how do you see that? How do you see it drive that business value? And how is Netflix specifically? You all come from different areas, and you're joining Netflix. So how do you see Netflix fostering that. You can't just say we're not going to be diverse and inclusive. You've got to do the work. So the two-part question is, how do you see, or some stories and examples of how that competitive advantage is increasing and you're solving cool business challenges because you're diverse and inclusive, and how do you see that being fostered and grown at Netflix due to the culture and the way the business is operated? And we'll go down the road. I think that you all probably have something you want to share here. If someone wants to get started, Jen.
Yeah, I can kick it off. I mean, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head, right? Like and you talked about it in your presentation, like we started in the US and Canada, and then we went to Latin America, and then like now, and then it's just grown, and we're a global company now. We're telling stories for a global audience. We have to reflect the audience to whom we're telling these stories. Otherwise, it's not coming from a genuine place. So that level of commitment by our production teams, by our product teams across the company, that they really internalize that in a way that I've actually been really surprised, pleasantly surprised at how much that means to everybody. I look at some of our content, like Orange is the New Black, which is, at the time that it came out, that was not really like anything else on television. And there are some titles we've released since then that are really not like anything else on television. I think Nanette, if you haven't seen that, is another incredibly powerful example. That they are on Netflix because we have people who believe in those stories. Those stories resonate with them, and they want to share that with the global audience. So I think continuing to look at our content and think about how is that reflected by the people at Netflix, and if it's not, we need to change that. And I think that constant reflection is really powerful.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to share a story?
Yeah, I can go. I've got a story.
Yeah.
So like a real life example of how, especially in the content space, it's so important to have diversity of, even just taste. So like, everybody on our team watches different things. A recent example that came up was we got a question about why there was this sort of weird behavior on a reality TV show where every other episode had like no viewing. And it sort of caused kind of a panic, and we're like, shoot, we're going to have to go and figure this out. And a bunch of data scientists jumped on it saying, hey, I think I have time, I'll figure this out tonight. And then my colleague who sits next to me kind of sheepishly was like, Megan, I think I know why. Because I watched the show, and she was a little embarrassed about it because it was like this British reality TV show. I think this was Love Island, I think it was. It's a quality program, but yeah, totally. But then she was like, I know what's happening. It's because there's recap episodes after each one, and if you're just watching through it, you're skipping it and going to the next episode. And her email saved a bunch of people a lot of time, but just having that context of what our content is about is huge. And in terms of how Netflix fosters diversity, even on my own team, it's, I think, pretty much 50-50 women and men, and my VP and her boss above her are both women, and I think that goes a really long way. That I've been really fortunate, and everywhere I've gone, I've had strong female leadership, and it's something I've kind of taken for granted. I mean, even my mom is a DBA, so like there was no question growing up that this is something I could do. But seeing those strong women in a position of leadership makes it really clear that Netflix is a place that supports that, and there's no question that if that's something I want to do, I can pursue that too.
Yeah, thank you. Rashmi, we were talking, you brought up that global audience now, and the idea that, the power of words and understanding titles and the change. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so we've, at least in the last, I would say year and a half, we've launched titles that have gained a global audience. And honestly, after seeing the title reports, I've gone back and seen those shows which I would have never seen.
That's cool.
So it works both ways. And it's titles that, I think we had La Casa de Papel, which was in Spanish, but which has taken on a global audience, or Dark, which is in German, which has taken on a global audience. And those are titles that I went back and watched after hearing about them from people outside of Netflix. Really.
That's cool.
So that's really great.
Yeah.
There's one more story that I do want to share on this
Yes.
one. That is maybe a little bit more to the inclusion angle, but Netflix's culture is also really big on feedback. And one year I got some feedback from someone, and it was a male colleague of mine, And he said, you do really great work, but a lot of the time you're prefacing it with like, this might not work, or this is just an idea, or this just, or some type of qualifier before I said it. And he told me straight up, stop saying that, you have good ideas. And I was floored because no male colleague of mine had ever been that direct or that upfront, and it was really, really powerful.
That's awesome. I know I've had a friend here in the audience who's an amazing male friend of mine who actually convinced me to start the Chicago Women in Big Data group. And I think that idea of advocacy and standing up and helping and hearing it from someone who's not just like you, or we help each other out, but that diversity and someone calling you out on the qualifier is awesome.
Sure.
You actually, on the topic of inclusion, you are actually going to bring up, I think you have a VP of inclusion as well, Monisha?
We do. We have Verna Myers, who's joined Netflix as the VP of Inclusion. And one little quote that internally we talk about, which I think is really useful, is diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusion is being asked to dance. I think
Oh, I like that. Oh, I like that a lot. We'll end that question on that one. And really, and then hopefully you can all take that back to your organizations to make a difference. And quote that. You can absolutely take that quote from the Innovation VP of Netflix. So we are at time. Can I don't know where my timekeeper is. Can I get 2 questions from the audience, or do we want to? I don't know where she is. We're just okay, we'll do 2 quick questions. Keep your answers really short and quick, and then we're going to break for networking. So I see 2 hands here, ma'am, you in the back, and then you right there. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jessica Esquivel. I'm actually a high energy physicist. We work with a lot of data as well, so this is really interesting. My question is, how is the culture at Netflix with regards to intersectionality with respect to diversity and inclusion? Let me preface that there's about 20% women with their PhD in physics, but when you start looking at the intersection between race and gender, there's 150 Black women with their PhD in physics. 150 people. So I was just wondering how that relates to Netflix.
I think that's something that Renee has talked with us a lot about. I think, like any company in the tech space, there's room for us to improve. But I think some of the conversations that I've been in recently too, around inclusion, like for the whole company, have been really powerful. I'm thinking about, okay, no one is like just a woman. No one is just a man. Someone can be LGBTQ, like Black female. Someone can be a transgendered man. Like there are all of these different aspects of identity that I think as a company we're talking about a lot more. And it's been really powerful to think about how something Renee has mentioned and other speakers at the company as well, that when we're in a meeting or in any kind of event, this concept of if we're entering into a situation with some type of privilege, right, because of our background or some attribute of our identity, being better about finding ways to lend that, right? If that means, calling someone out for interrupting, even if it's innocuous, right, even if they don't mean it, just think, hey, like, it's a great idea, Karen, were you finished? Or there are a lot of figures of speech that I think we throw around without really thinking about what they can mean. Like lame actually has a lot of connotations for people that are differently abled. And I think similar to that culture of feedback, being comfortable being uncomfortable in bringing up those types of examples so that we all get better and we show to everybody at the company that we're really committed to being better. So does that answer your question, Kim?
Yes, thank you.
Great. And then one more. Go ahead.
I love all the presentations, thank you. And when you talk about detail about how everything that you do is very collaborative, and there's an intersection of like art and science and creativity and encounter that like people are speaking different languages when you talk to artists or like filmmakers, and you talk about that data and they're like, we've done this way for a long time, and we were talking about changing the way we schedule things or like telling us like, what genre this fits into TV space and like that.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. I'll just read it really quickly. The question is about really that translation between maybe you're using the same words but different meanings and audiences.
Yeah.
Did you say you were going to take that?
I think I can speak to that. So, especially being on the analytics side, the people I'm interfacing with are oftentimes not as technical, and I think that's actually one of my favorite things about the job is how do I translate what I'm talking about into a story that they're going to understand. So I think that's huge, but you're totally right. I mean, for somebody who's been in purely a creative space to come and talk to a data scientist, there's going to be some, kind of talking past each other. So there's a lot of relationship building too. So I was fortunate in that when I came into the role, there was already a really strong partnership with the content analytics team and the content creative teams. So they already kind of saw us as partners, which means that you're just naturally more open when you walk into that conversation. But if you were to start from the beginning, the first thing is really building that trust and saying, well, we're here to help, not to kind of speak over you or use language that you don't understand. So I'll often kind of catch myself using acronyms or things that they're not going to understand and don't really have anything to do with the conversation. And I think that's a huge skill and I kind of credit my consulting background too, to being able to translate what you're talking about into different terms.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much again. Give a round of applause for our panelists and our speakers. And thank you all for being here. So this concludes the formal portion of our evening. A couple quick housekeeping items. You don't have to go. We have an amazing networking session after this. Quick, very much housekeeping. So the lift code that you got a new email sometime around the start of this event with an updated code. So that should be in your inbox. If you were going to use the lift code, check your email. There was an updated code that was sent out, so you can use that. We have our panelists that are sticking around for networking afterwards. I know we didn't get to a lot of questions, so they're here. Network with each other, learn from each other, absolutely stay around. We've got dessert, more networking in the back until 9 o'clock. Thank you, huge thank you to the team at Netflix. Follow She Rules. This is going to be, I think Atlanta's coming up next. I mean, there's some incredible work going on in the space. So follow She Rules, Netflix Data on Twitter. Look up these women, continue to network with each other. Cannot thank Netflix enough for picking Chicago as their first stop on this national road show. So thank you so much, you guys, and have fun tonight. And it's all set up in the back, so get up and start mingling.